Because we know conversations like this can go on, and please feel free to meet them outside if you have any questions you'd like to understand. Speaking of gender lens opportunities, investments in AI, STEM, one theme which has been coming up has been the need to pool in different forms of capital, blending capital, catalytic capital. And discussing all this will be our next panel, where we discuss the role of different forms of capital in the impact continuum. So as we at IIC look at the interest that's coming in from CSR, from philanthropy, from family offices, what could be the pathway to really channelizing these different forms of capital into action is what we'll hear now from our host of experts. Inviting our panel speakers on stage. Bharat V, Executive Director with the British Asian Trust. Nicole Rycraft, Founder and Executive Director, Canopy. Neerav Khambati, Partner at the Blended Finance Company. Prashant Venkatesh, Marketing Director, Brand Unilever and Sustainability Unilever. Rahul Khanna, Co-Founder and Managing Partner, Trifecta Capital. Steering this conversation is Jasjeet Mangat, Senior Advisor with Trifecta.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, which is the thing that lies between you and lunch, that famous session. So we're going to try to make this as interesting, interactive, and useful to you as possible, and also get you to lunch quickly. We have a terrific panel assembled here today to deal with a topic that can be called the elephant in the room. And what I mean by that is the old Indian story about there being an elephant in the room and there being 4 or 5 blindfolded people, and anyone who touches the elephant or a part of the elephant has a certain view of what it is, and the same can be said for the continuum of capital as well. Different people perceive that term, that very fluid term, it's a fluid term by its very definition, in different ways. And so this panel has been carefully put together because everyone defines the capital continuum in a slightly different way from the other. But our hope is that by the end of the session, that you get not just the perspective that everyone has on the capital continuum, but how it all stitches together into a broad and an effective ecosystem, and how these various parts are interlocking and complementary with each other. So with that as a setup, what I'd ask my fellow panel members to do is to introduce themselves to you, but introduce themselves from the perspective of what they think the capital continuum to be. So this introduction will last for about 10 or 12 minutes because everyone will define who they are and what they're doing, but also what is the meaning of the capital continuum for them. And then we'll use that very weighty introduction to then come in and define a couple of architectural ways that you can think of the capital continuum, and we'll take it from there. So if that makes sense, then I'll turn over to my left and we pass along the microphones. Yeah.
Thank you. I must confess, the first question I asked today morning was, what is the impact continuum? But I'm going to try and just give you my perspective on how at Unilever we have been looking at it over the past few years. So in my role as a sustainability director, primarily it is about how do we accelerate sustainability. So HUL, as you all know, is the largest FMCG company in India, been around for 100 plus years, 50 plus brands, everything from Surf Excel to Lifebuoy to Dove. And I think after a lot of thinking, just early this year, we announced our sort of new sustainability goals, right? And I think that just gives you a flavor of where could impact come in. So one really being climate, and I don't have to speak more about that. Second, around nature, because we're also a foods company. We also procure a lot of material which is from agriculture. So everything to do with nature. We're also a company, all our products use water. So we also, it's a huge space of interest to us. Then there is plastics and everything to do with plastics and materials. And the fourth one being livelihoods, and again, don't have to comment too much about that. In addition, I think we're a listed company in India. We have 29 factories. So communities is a huge part of it. So for me, community is really communities, gender, all of that cuts across. So I don't even see it as a fifth pillar. And what we are really trying to do is take action on sustainability to not just for building a more resilient Unilever, but also to make sure that we are working with our stakeholders, right? So I'm just going to take maybe 30 seconds in defining how do we take action on sustainability. First, it starts with our operations. So if you think about a topic like climate, let's say emissions or water, how do we reduce emissions in our own factories, right? That's the first thing which you can do. And obviously, capital for that will be, what you're using from your balance sheet, or, how do you fund that, right? Second is we have to work with our value chain. So, we have suppliers ranging from listed large companies to really small suppliers. So how do you work with your value chain partners to accelerate sustainability, to help you achieve your goals, but also in, let's say, the country's goals? And that means doing a lot of capacity building, working with them, sharing your emission plans, sharing your water targets, so that they know that, okay, look, we need to align, otherwise, there is a challenge of us not being, a preferred vendor anymore, right? The third is, I think the strongest action actually happens when we put it on our brands. I think on climate, we have not had too many examples, but I think we're going to get there. We've started to do a large-scale pilots, on detergents. Can we use more lower emission materials, for example? Dove is a great example, stands for real beauty, but also working with UNICEF on, educating girl children in India at scale on, sort of mental well-being and resilience. And the last one, so I started with operations, value chain, your brands, and the broader ecosystem, right? And communities and country. And that's where CSR funds really, really play a factor as well. So, for instance, let me just take one example. So water, we really work on reducing water in our own emissions. So we've reduced water in our own operations by more than 50%. Try and bring in more water efficient products, more water efficient shampoos, more water efficient detergents. And on CSR, for instance, we are now working with nearly 3 lakh farmers across the country through the Water Foundation, the Hindustan Unilever Foundation, whereby we're trying to promote better agricultural practices, which means water gets conserved. There is more water, right, in rural India. And I'll just take the last 10 seconds. I think there's different kinds of capital comes into use in multiple places. Some of it could be your own capital. Some of it could be partnerships with other corporates. CSR funds really do help in some places. We'll talk about that separately. But we also have, very good partnerships, for example, with the British government, with the US government, on supporting startups, on who could potentially become suppliers to us in the future and help us achieve our sustainability goals. So,
Bharat. Thanks so much, Jasjeet. My name is Bharat. I am with the British Asian Trust, which is an organization that has used an approach towards outcomes-based financing as the primary lever through which we have looked at many of the areas in which we work. So we're very focused on outcomes. We work in sectors that include education, skilling, conservation, mental health. And across each of these, what we try to do is to bring a clear focus on how we can actually deliver better outcomes. Right? And one of the instruments that we've been using is this approach of outcomes-based financing. And over the past several years now, I think we started out in 2018 in the education space with something that we call the Quality Education India Impact Bond. And this was a way to bring in a variety of different forms of capital. We are now onto our third impact bond in the education space. We've done one in the skilling space as well. And across all of these, what we found is these are great instruments to pool in different forms of capital, whether it's CSR, government or quasi-government bodies like the National Skills Development Corporation, philanthropy, but also private return-seeking capital, right? Because these are instruments using which you can allow for a return to be achieved while also achieving impact on a certain objective. And so with the Quality Education Impact Bond, for example, we achieved about a 2.5x return in learning outcomes for the students that participated in it. through all of the specific ed tech tools that were used, right? The variety of ed tech platforms that were service providers in that program. And that, as I said, achieved this 2.5x learning improvement at about half the cost that we had envisaged originally. And in the process of doing that, it generated about an 8% return for the investor that had taken the risk of whether this would actually pay off or not. Right? And so it's been a great instrument for us to actually bring in return-seeking capital into areas that might otherwise never have brought in that form of capital. Right? Again, education, skilling. We are now working on an impact bond focused on foundational literacy and numeracy, and working in partnership with government systems so that it can scale very readily and rapidly. And so this is being done across 5 different states. All of the programs put together will reach about 4 million children. And it's again a great way for a private investor looking to generate capital in this form. In this case, it's the SDG Outcomes Fund that has come in as an investor in that instrument. And they are targeting a return that could be somewhere close to 10%, depending on what the outcomes are of the program. Right? So a great way to achieve that sort of outcome. And so I think in terms of the returns continuum, I think we sit somewhere right in the middle. But I think what the instrument allows for is to really focus on the impact that can be achieved because of the way that it's actually defined in terms of the way that metrics are measured and so on, which I'm sure we can get into in more detail. But it puts us sort of somewhere squarely in the middle of that returns continuum. Not quite market rates of return, but decent returns on achieving great impacts in some of these sectors that we work in.
Thanks, Bharat. Nicole?
Testing 1, 2. Excellent. All right. So I think one of the things that I find so exciting about this is that, like, this is such a broad kind of, like, I mean, the role of different types of capital in impact continuum. It's like, it's almost endless with the ways that it can be sliced and diced. And I think we've been hearing about that over the last day and a half. I'll start with, Canopy. We're a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization. So philanthropy fuels our work to create the business and the market conditions for there to be a change in business as usual. And so we are working with just under 1,000 brands. They represent 1.7 trillion in annual revenues, so significant market heft. They create by sending very clear signals around a lack of tolerance for high carbon, high biodiversity value forests, and a desire to see more circular content, circular materials in their supply chain. They create the market conditions, which then enable or create the investment conditions. And so philanthropy, I would say, plays a critical role with those of us that work in the ecosystem enabling side of things. Then, of course, when it comes to the actual investment or finance stack, we need to be not just looking at specific ventures, we need to be transforming entire supply chains on timelines that we have not had to contemplate before. And so really it's about all forms of capital being on deck in all myriad of different vehicles of delivery. Blended finance stacks with DFIs and first loss capital, private equity and growth equity funds. I think that there's the myriad of different structures and vehicles and forms of investment that are needed. And then parallel to the formal investment stream, I think is an equally important level of investment that is happening within corporates to help de-risk investment into these new supply chains, these new low carbon circular or kind of the renewable space or the low carbon circular material space. Is the money that's being invested in R&D, in pilots, in developing letters of intent to purchase, of paying green premiums for first to market products that aren't quite at economy of scale. And so I think there are 3 kind of parallel streams of investment, one of which is kind of probably a more classic investment impact continuum.
So we're already seeing that the capital continuum and the impact continuum is defined very broadly by each individual player here. And it'll give us a chance to figure out how all these different continua interact with each other as the panel progresses. We'll request a shift in batting order, and Nirav, if you could explain what the capital continuum means to you, and then we'll have Rahul give his definition.
Thanks, Jaspreet. We are the new kid on the block, or the blended finance company, and we hope to bring this childlike curiosity to this white space that lies between where pure philanthropy stops and where market-based risk-adjusted returns begin, right? And that's a fairly large space. I mean, one could argue that it's $4.2 trillion per annum simply because that's the SDG investment gap. So whether it's trying to figure out how to get youth from low-income families to get skilling loans, where banks would reject their application simply because of the financial status of their parents, or figuring out how to improve the incidence of parametric insurance amongst low-income families, particularly in rural areas which are most prone to climate disasters, or to figure out how to get affordable financing to WASH-focused MSMEs in India, or to look at what are the opportunities in which the purchasing power of state governments for the midday meals program be leveraged for promoting climate-smart agricultural practices among smallholder farmers. These are the kind of things that really excite us, those are the kind of projects that we work on. From a return continuum, or the capital continuum as it's referred to, it's fairly straightforward. We work between where there is zero return, not even the capital coming back, all the way to what different stakeholders have in terms of return expectations, which in rupee terms is usually a double-digit figure. On the impact continuum, it's a bit more tricky because every sector has its own set of impact measures. For climate, it could be number of gigatons of climate emissions that get saved. For education, it could be number of equivalent years of learning as it's referred to. Therefore, the common measure that we use on the impact continuum is the income level of the families that we serve. And our focus is across all the sectors that we work. We have to serve families in the low income strata, which different governments have different ways of defining. US government defines that at less than $3.2 per day of income.
So Nirav, a follow-up question for you. You defined a capital continuum, you defined an impact continuum. You also anchored yourself on a certain income strata, a certain requirement from a government perspective. Are there other continua as well? For example, are there certain stages chronologically where certain capital and certain interventions play a role in order to create an ecosystem or an environment in which some of the other sources of capital can come and play later or earlier?
No, that's a great question, and thanks for asking that. The third continuum, actually, which does not get often discussed, is a risk continuum. Across various stages, different organizations, different initiatives present a different risk profile to investors, right? I mean, and there could be a very, very interesting combination, high risk but very high returns, but also high risk and actually no returns. So for example, the space in which Prashant would play, right? I mean, supporting enterprises, ventures, ideas, which are highly risky, but somebody has to come in to bring that adventure capital to sort of show the path of where government capital, for example, can be deployed, or the kind of initiatives that Bharat and his organization is pursuing in terms of various outcomes-based funding mechanisms, where some really tall targets are set. If the government funding's delivering X outcomes, how can we increase that to 4X using different kinds of theories of change? So I would think that risk is the third continuum that needs to be factored in, and it presents an opportunity to bring things like technical assistance, for that matter, where a market can be studied, or guarantee structures where risk discovery can happen at a low cost. And then, of course, to sort of scale those up, things like subordinated debt could come in. And this is the entire gamut of concessional capital that impact-first investors could bring in, so that a fertile ground is created for organizations like Rahul's to say that, yes, we are looking at very high impact, but we also want to ensure that the pension fund money that our investors are putting in is actually done justice to.
And that's an excellent segue to Rahul.
Thanks, Jasjeet. So I'm with Trifecta Capital. We do private credit and growth equity investing. I'll build on what he said about risk. And so the way we think about it is that, for companies to have impact, they need to survive and thrive. So we think of 3 stages of risk. Early stage risk, which we call concept risk, which is there something here that people are willing to consume and pay for? Then we think about execution risk, which is, can this company scale? And then we think about exit risk, which is, can there be a liquidity event? So if you think about concept, execution, and exit risk, these are sort of 3 different stages of a company's life. And with that, you need capital at every stage. I'd like to believe that the equity side of the market is reasonably well developed, at least in the commercial space. Across early, growth, and late, we now have significant capital coming in. I'd say in the impact world, maybe the growth and late stage capital still needs to be built, but on the pure commercial investing side, it's quite a large market. On the credit side of the house, we're starting to see different kinds of solutions emerge at the concept stage. Now, candidly, the risks are very high, so that may not be a great fit for the kinds of solutions we provide, but maybe there are other products that need to be built at that have a debt-like flavor, but maybe are provided in a manner that people are willing to take a higher loss. And then, of course, there's growth debt, and then there's subordinated and mezzanine that comes at a much later. So I'd say for us, the impact continuum is the stages that a company goes through that's delivering impact, and then the capital structures both on debt and equity.
So that's an excellent lay of the land, and maybe what I'll try and use as a narrative structure now is to put Prashant on the spot and say for the rest of this panel and the rest of this conversation, we'll try to get to 2 diagonally opposite ends of where Prashant and the Hindustan Unilever business is involved, which is on one end of the scale, call it the lower left if you will. There's a government mandated requirement for a CSR spend, and that, as the points made by Nirav and others are, that those can be in extremely risky endeavors. At the other end of the scale, at the top right if you will be where Unilever's own corporate venturing strategy might sit, or Lever itself as a behemoth public company sits. And so to go from an organization that's supported by CSR funds at one end of the scale to Lever, which is a giant in the Indian Sensex at the other end of the scale, that's a continuum. And that continuum, the question that we'll pose our panel is what's the role they're playing in the migration from a CSR supported organization on one end of the scale to entering the public markets, perhaps with Rahul's help, and then ending up at a scale and a size that Prashant has with Lever. And so I'll ask the questions in order of that progression, and start again with Prashant in terms of just describing the sorts of organizations that you think of from a CSR perspective, but which will then grow or expand in such a way that from a value chain perspective, there might be organizations that Nicole might be in the ecosystem to help develop and evolve, and then we'll take it from Nicole to the next step.
So I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction. I know you've said the word organization, but maybe I'm going to talk about the thematic area, right? Because I think what CSR as a source of capital sometimes is I think the positives are that in many ways from an impact lens is that it's very time bound. So you have to spend the money in 1 year, right? So can you believe that? I mean, for an impact person, you've been asked to spend money every single year and deliver impact. On the other hand, of course, you can't invest it in a space, there are very, very clear rules in a project where the main objective of the project is to generate profits, right? You can generate a surplus, right? But that surplus is not then given back to the funder or to your investor. The surplus, you're encouraged to generate a surplus because the surplus can then go back into the venture itself to create more impact, right? So that's a huge difference. And I'm just going to take, two examples over here of CSR and, how it can be used. One is if you take the example of waste, right? And circular economy is a concept which is now all around the world. You throw a rock, you'll find somebody who says they are working in circular economy. Now in India, you cannot deliver anything on circularity unless you create inclusive livelihoods, right? And that is a fact. The entire circularity value chain, whether it's plastics, whether it is textiles, whether it is materials, whether it is agri, ultimately you have to create livelihoods for the people who are creating that circularity. So that could be Safai Sathis, it could be the farmers. And somebody once told me that they do the donkey's share of the work, but they don't get the lion's share of the profits, right? So CSR really helps in making sure that people who are otherwise marginalized in the circular economy can then get access to, could be, government programs, government schemes, could get access to philanthropic capital, which I don't think any venture capital investor would even want to, spend time with, right? But that is very, very important because otherwise you're not going to create any circular economy for which, a trifecta capital or any other investor would be even interested in, right? That's the first part. So that's why CSR for me on circularity, one of the big projects which we are leading and we want to dial it up 10x over the next 3 years is a big partnership with UNDP. We're trying to get more corporates on board, whereby we are getting more inclusion of sanitation workers into the formal economy. I think there are 4 million sanitation workers in India, according to government census. We are at 10,000. I think it's been a very slow but very painful start, but I'm sure now we can scale it up. On the same example of circularity, I'm going to say how CSR funds can help in another way. There are multiple incubators now, and I think Nachiket from the IIM Bangalore team is there in the second half of the day. And I think CSR funds can be utilized for supporting solutions. So you could be a startup whose entity is completely designed as a for-profit, and your end goal is to go to a venture capitalist and raise funds. You can receive CSR funds, but then it's very, very clear that the profit which you generate from that cannot go back to the CSR donor, right? So there are multiple now incubators and across the country for which all sorts of companies are supporting through CSR funds. But the end objective there is to create solutions which can then be scaled up to solve some of these difficult challenges.
Nicole?
Sure, happy to pick up the baton from that, and I think there's a nice synergy. Clearly, there's a firewall between CSR and the application of CSR funds, and as well as the other side of corporate investment, which is in basically developing the supply chains that brands, companies like Unilever, brands that we work with, like Walmart, like Zara, need for the 21st century. And these are low-carbon, circular material supply chains. And so we see that taking place in a number of different ways, and our role within that, working with corporates, is partly to help de-risk the supply chain and the rapid scale-up of these disruptive kind of new technologies and production systems, so that they're happening on the timelines that businesses need, as well as on the timelines that ecologically we need them to be happening on, and socially. And so that de-risking takes place in a couple of different ways, and perhaps is a form of investment in the more kind of general sense, in that, so we work with a pipeline of 100 different innovators for the paper packaging and wood-based textiles, rayon and viscose supply chains. They're all at different TRLs, but those that are ready to move to commercial scale production, because it's a 15x scale up from a pilot, commercial pilot facility, then a way to de-risk that investment rather than it being catalytic or first loss capital, because these are commercial ventures. There's private equity going into the space. It doesn't want to seem as though, kind of, as soon as you bring first loss capital in, it can create concerns for a certain class of investor. And so we work with brands and conventional producers to help de-risk that by them writing letters of intent to purchase, with them developing offtake agreements that help underwrite the first, half or the first 3 years worth of production as a way of providing security or some sort of level of assurity for investors. We see increasingly, even within supply chains that have not conventionally invested vertically within their production systems, we are now seeing brands invest at a VC level primarily at this point in specific innovations, because companies and retailers are looking at how they future-proof their supply chains. Supply chains are being disrupted by the climate crisis. And so there's an acknowledgement of the need for them not just to be leveraging their purchasing power, but also the investment capital that they have. And so that's generally happening at Series A, B, sometimes Series C. I think what's now being looked at is how can they be strategic LPs within kind of broader commercial kind of PE funds and things like that.
Terrific. So Nicole, you laid out the continuum out here from a supply chain perspective, suppliers and enabling suppliers and enabling an ecosystem around that. Bharat, I'd like to shift to you to think in terms of a value chain. And, you know, education and skilling is a market that you're targeting. And taking the visual metaphor of a baton, what are you doing for whom, picking up the baton from, and who are you handing it to in your continuum?
You know, it's a great question, because I think it allows us to sort of frame the conversation also from the point of view of, you know, going back to the point about the risk continuum as well as the impact continuum that Neera was making earlier. But I think when we look at the value chain, I think that, you know, if we take skilling as an example, right? I think what we tend to do is to focus on the providers that are most interested in having a specific type of impact, right? And so, you know, again, going back to the impact continuum and to say, you could look at a certain provider of capital or a service who is looking, you know, wherever they might lie in the value chain, to look at a specific extent of risk that they are willing to take, right? That might be a high degree of risk, as Prashant and Nicole have spoken about, or it could be a relatively low degree of risk where they're looking for a more certain sort of type of return. But I think what's also interesting is to break that value chain down and to then say, where along the impact continuum do you want to lie? And to actually specify that. Right? And that's what some of our work has been able to do, is to actually say, look, there is a certain type of demographic, for example, that we want to target with a program. Right? This might be a smallholder farmer as an example. And if you don't specify this, you run the risk that, you know, the program that you're running is sort of almost agnostic to the specific demographic, the specific outcome that you might otherwise be looking to target. Right? So again, thinking about the impact continuum and saying, you know, if there is a specific type of impact that you're looking to target, then just leaving that to the market or to different types of capital alone is not necessarily the best way of doing it. You would instead want to say, you know, how do I ensure that I actually define a certain target in terms of the impact that I'm looking to create, and ensure that I design the program around that impact, and then bring in other types of capital, bring in different players on the value chain who can then help me achieve that type of impact. So I think that's where a lot of our work has focused, is on sort of specifying the impact that you're looking to create, and then working with people across, you know, different elements of the value chain and different capabilities of taking risk or risk appetite to actually help achieve that outcome.
No, that's excellent. Rahul, I'd like to turn to you now. And continuum and a capital continuum, in the way you think about it, is almost definitional. You're part of a cap table and a cap stack in companies, but the role that venture debt plays in companies, and especially in the impact universe, as we're increasingly seeing, is a fairly wide range. Venture debt is the funding that can extend the runway on private capital, private equity funded companies. It can reduce dilution for founders and teams that have hit upon a winning formula. It can extend the timeline to the next funding or liquidity event, whether it's going to the public markets. On the other hand, at the other end of the continuum scale, venture debt can be extremely important financing for impact investments that are critical, they're required by an ecosystem, but they're taking a little bit longer. Their proof points are a little bit harder to come by, and just everything is sort of a little bit extended where the equity investors are stretched a little bit thin. Could you talk a little bit about the use cases of venture debt in the capital continuum to help deliver results to your stakeholders, and especially from an impact investing community, in terms of what are the sorts of things that venture debt can bring to the table, because it's a relatively new financial tool for the impact investment community?
So, our color of money is complementary to equity, at least on the venture debt side. So, as a first principle, we typically will go into businesses that are able to attract some amount of equity financing. But along with that equity, there's the whole notion of a balance sheet and saying, okay, how do I finance my growth? We feel that there is a very large role for credit in the new economy, and particularly around the emerging sectors, including climate, because a lot of those businesses are going to be asset driven. So whether you're looking at batteries, you're looking at charging infrastructure, you're looking at OEMs that are doing three-wheeler, four-wheeler, and then of course the recycling elements of that. So you made a point that, in these companies, sometimes growth takes longer. A lot of these companies are being built on the ground. This is not my favorite term, but phygital. There's a digital element and a physical element. And so the digital part can scale a lot more quickly, but the physical part, is more linear. And so what we find is that in general, as capital comes in, it works on a certain timeline. And the experience in the last 10 years has been that things just take longer. Businesses have more capital intensity, and therefore margins also come under pressure. So if you can add more leverage into the mix, it generally improves returns for everyone. So I think our view on this is that, the world of sort of commercial credit and the world of impact are converging very quickly, because the sectors that are rising tide sectors, including agri and climate, need a lot more debt. We've already seen the poster child of that intersection being financial inclusion, where you had a set of impact investors lead the charge, and then everybody showed up at the party. Hopefully, a few other sectors like that can attract similar types of commercial capital.
That's a great point. Nirav, you have a very versatile toolkit. You have a variety of different tools in your toolkit. And if we think of the equity impact investor as the person that you're taking the baton from and handing the baton to, the person that you're running the race along with, you're surrounding them from all sides. Can you give us a couple of specific examples of where and how you'd use different tools in your toolkit? You mentioned a risk continuum. So where does a TADA come into play? You spoke about subordinated debt, etc. Where does that come into play? And maybe a third and last example around a concessional rate of equity return or a first loss guarantee of some sort. So if you could pick up a couple of these tools, but if you could exemplify them against specific examples that make it live for the impact equity investors in the room.
Certainly. Before TBFC, my life was an equity impact investor. And between a decade of doing that and running Tata Class Edge, I think one realized that impact and returns don't necessarily go hand in hand. If you're able to find such a deal, that's like gold mine. But there's a lot of good impact work that needs sub-par returns because the world needs those initiatives to be undertaken. To specifically come to the point that you made around, the toolkit that we have, I'd like to give an example of an initiative that we worked on. My colleagues Shivam and Yashi, who are sitting behind, are leading that. This is in recognition of the problem that India, despite all the government initiatives, has a very large water sanitation hygiene issue on hand. Even today, about between 90 and 100 million people in India don't get access to clean drinking water. I mean, that's the nature of the issue that we have, right? And it's worth keeping in mind that 90% of all the investments that are made in the sector are made by the government. So how do we get more private sector involvement in the wash sector? Was the challenge that we took on. Our theory of change is the more private sector coming in would actually help meet some of the issues in the wash sector. Now, we worked backwards and said, so what's the issue? Why the private sector is not coming in? Clearly, the point that Rahul made, access to affordable credit was an issue. And then we looked at the credit providers. We had people like Nabsamruddhi and IndusInd Bank who have large allocations specifically, since wash is a priority sector for the government, specifically for wash, but they were not able to give that money out. And so then the next why followed, and 4 specific problems emerged. The first was a lot of these enterprises are unable to scale because they don't have access to credit because of lack of positive net worth. Right? They are young enterprises and they sort of need some kind of equity cushion on their balance sheet before the lenders could come in. So that was one. Second, enterprises were young. They didn't actually know how to access the credit markets. The third was whatever actually available is found by them to be more expensive than what today at this stage of their business can afford. And finally, the credit providers, if they had to be more impactful, were looking for some level of a support around losses that they might potentially incur. So what are we doing? To tackle the problem of net worth, we are tying up with organizations like Prashant's to say, bring in some money as grant capital so that there could be a net worth boost on top of which there could be a fairly significant leverage. So every dollar that Prashant would bring in would result into $3 additional coming in the form of credit. To address the issue of high interest rates, we're tying up with organizations like Bharat's, which would provide interest subvention linked to the impact objectives that have been achieved. Right? So these would be outcomes-based funding, whereby interest subsidies would be provided if these organizations are able to deliver on impact. In order to solve the problem of these organizations not entirely knowing how to even write a loan application, we've tied up with organizations like Nichols. And these are, the organizations may be different. Nichols equivalent for us is water.org. Prashant's equivalent for us is BMGF. Bharat's equivalent in our case is the blended finance company itself. And then the guarantees come from organizations like USAID, so that the lender itself feels a bit de-risked. So that's one example. Similarly, we are working with Seva, who are running a livelihood resilience and recovery fund and enabling green entrepreneurs, who are mostly women, to help households in rural areas adopt green appliances. And there again, we're helping them raise concessional debt, which could mean lower cost of borrowing for these households, which gets backed by guarantees that come from organizations like Rabo Foundation.
No, that's excellent. So we've gone through a couple of sweeps here on a very accomplished but a very disparate panel in defining continua in different way, and then also how these continua merge into each other, aid each other, grow each other. But you can see that what sounds like a straightforward concept, once you open it up, there's a wealth of nuance and detail and expertise and capability that underlies it. So what I'd like to do now is to actually turn it into a bit of an open session, because it really is the topic from your perspective and the questions that you have. And we'll do something novel here, where we'll keep not only will our panel here answer your questions, but the panel themselves are also free to pose questions on areas that need to be addressed. So while folks figure out a question that needs to be asked, I'll look around the room to see if there's any burning question that jumps right up, or ask my panel if they have any questions to ask. Nicole?
Is it because I wore a loud jacket that I'm getting picked on? All right. So, to my learned colleagues more broadly in the room. So, part of Canopy's work is to conserve forest ecosystems by transforming these kind of conventional take-make waste production systems to be fundamentally more circular. India is extraordinarily well positioned to be a global leader in low-carbon circular materials production. We anticipate that it's going to take $13 to $15 billion over the next decade to actually build the infrastructure, the production infrastructure, and the enabling kind of and supporting business ecosystem to actually have India be a leading producer of agricultural residue packaging, paper, and textile-derived viscose and rayon textiles for the fashion industry. And so if we were to look at kickstarting that broader kind of tranche of investment in India with, say, a $2 billion kind of blended finance fund, then what would that look like?
Prashant?
No, I have a question as well. I think it's, we were just discussing this earlier, I think the next 5 years, we need to accelerate sustainability, right? I think, let's face it, and unfortunately, India, if you look at even what the government has been saying about Viksit Bharat, on the one hand, you have to deliver great health and well-being outcomes. On the other hand, there is a climate crisis, right? So therefore, how do we accelerate action over the next 5 years? And one great area is low-carbon materials, because India is going to grow, we are going to consume more, people are going to buy more bikes, more materials, right? But how do we at the same time ensure that we are assisting or leading the way in the climate transition? So acceleration is a big question for me, and particularly therefore then acceleration of capital in going into the right projects.
So Nirav, looking at you, so this is the problem statement. We're dealing in consumer goods and a physical value chain, a physical supply chain, creating a canopy, a $2 billion canopy for the development of low carbon or no carbon footprint that is required as inputs to a very large, giant consumer here, but a situation where, and affecting millions of people at subsistence levels. How would you string together these pearls to form a necklace?
Let me give it a shot, and then I'll sort of also invite my other colleagues to contribute. The guiding principle for putting together something like this is, don't be afraid of the mess. Many times when I talk about blended finance, the first reaction is this sounds so messy, so complicated. Why would you do this? Well, if we don't indulge in the mess, we'll end up leaving a mess behind. And now the next level of solutions are in that mess. So if we had as much as $2 billion of capital, I'd sort of go back and say, okay, how much leverage has TA provided around the world? So TA provides, every dollar of technical assistance would provide about $40 worth of other capital. So I'd say, okay, 2 billion divided by 40. I'm going to set aside a TA fund of that much capital because that is required. So $50 million I'm just going to set aside for technical assistance. If I had to do a guarantee structure, what's a market norm for a guarantee structure? The market norm for a guarantee structure of this sort is about 10%. So I'm going to put aside $200 million worth of guarantee. The leverage that one expects on commercial to concessional debt is in the range of about 4 to 5. So I'm going to tell myself that $800 million, I'll have to figure out how to get concessional capital so that I can then get $1.2 billion of commercial capital. I think the issue, this is fairly straightforward math, and I mean, all of us here can do this at the back of the hand. The issue is not that. The issue then is to be able to find those entrepreneurs and gain their trust. And actually then say that, okay, we will help you build your capacity, but in a manner that works for you, not in a manner that, not because we think you need it, but because you think you need it, right? I mean, so building that trust ecosystem is going to be the most challenging and messy task.
And so that's where it settles out, is that it's capital, it's continuum, but end of the day, it's ecosystem, it's trust, and there's sort of a national mission that's involved out here in terms of where you're going to. The moderators out here or the organizers are pointing to me saying that time is up, and I think hopefully we've done our job as a... Do you have something to say, Bharat?
Maybe I just add a quick point to what Neerav was mentioning as well, is just to say that, no, that's totally fine. It's just that I think in the way that Neerav was describing this, the fact that he's sort of going back to first principles and saying, what is the specific bottleneck? What is the challenge that needs to be addressed? I think it also requires, when you're looking at putting together big solutions to the kinds of challenges we are talking about, constantly going back to first principles and saying, what is the bottleneck? What is the challenge? And how do we address this? Using some of the tools that have been talked about. I think, organizations that can do that, approaches that look at that, approaches that look in that manner at the problem, I think is what we need to be doing a lot more of.
No, absolutely. So it's a variety of tools, and within the tool of capital, different place. And so hopefully we've done what a pre-lunch panel is supposed to do, which is to give everyone plenty of food for thought. And now on to real food. Thank you so much.